East Anglia. Around Lincoln alone, there are over 30 deserted airfields.
Saint Cecilia. That's it. They used to be playing when we went out. The last one went out, and the first one back always had to put the same record on. It was absolutely worn out, you know.
Skellingthorpe Airfield, 4 miles southwest of Lincoln. It's deserted today, but 25 years ago there were 2,500 people on this aerodrome, the base of 50 and 61 squadrons of Bomber Command RAF. A 2,500 strong community whose sole purpose was to keep the 16 Lancaster bombers from each squadron available for nightly sorties over occupied Europe.
Solitude and silently pray that heaven will protect you, dear, and there'll come a day the storm will be over and that we'll meet again at the shrine of Saint Cecilia.
Munich, Hanover, Berlin, Stuttgart, Augsburg, Essen, Nuremberg, Schweinfurt, Frankfurt, Marseille, Maid de Camp. On the 12th of May 1944, pilot Les Creed of 50 Squadron brought back his crew of 7 from their 31st bombing mission to complete their tour of operations.
I came home from the squadron and I met a couple of my old workmates, and now I felt on top of form actually, but I can always remember that one of them said, "God, don't you look bad?" Apparently I really looked, from what they remembered before, old and haggard, you know.
During the previous year, 50 Squadron had lost over 70 aircraft, equivalent to the squadron being replaced 4.5 times.
The peculiar part about people on aircrew and Bomber Command particularly is that you didn't go to France or Egypt and you stayed there, but you went and fought your war and you came back to England again. You took off one day and came back the next as a rule. And you were living two kinds of lives by having fought your war in a concentrated form while you were over the target. And you then came back to normal living and going down the local. The contrast was so great that some people couldn't take this.
Some of them who were under this particular tension, they were virtually a bag of nerves. They were carried by a twitching of the eye, or the way in which they talked to you, or the way in which they moved or did anything. And we used to say, because he's got the twitch, and very often one used to have a complete breakdown sometimes. They just felt they just couldn't go on. Well, in that case, the MO would see to them, and if an individual was more or less taken off of ops because of that, nervous tension, nervous disorder or breakdown, then they had their record stamped LMF, which stood for lack of moral fibre, which was a very nice way of calling the bloke a coward.
I can remember a report by one of the crews that he had actually shot at 4 enemy fighters. But it turned out, in fact, that he had shot at 4 Lancasters. His nerves went to pieces and he never flew again. I should think ruined for life, really.
Chap can't help it if it can't stand. And it was a hell of a strain. You know, I lifted the chap out of the aircraft one night. When I had his eye taken right out, you know, with a piece of shrapnel. He was sort of shivering. And
Got that water bottle then. Get rid of that trumpet. After you'd been doing an op, and you'd come back about 5 times, and you suddenly found that you'd carried something with you for those 5 times, you started believing that that something was a lucky charm.
I always used to fill my fountain pen. I had a waterman in those days. And what point there was in filling it, I don't know, because it was always empty when I came back. Because of the pressure difference. And I, invariably stained my uniform.
one of the pilots, the next person of mine, I believe it was, used to walk out with a top hat and tails. I mean, there's nothing more sillier than to see a bloke in flying dress with a top hat and tails, you know.
Once you knew the target and you were being briefed, you didn't think so much about it, but when you'd eaten your egg and you were getting into your flying kit, you started to get a bit butterfly. Not so much in the early stages of a tour, but when you get to about 20 operations, you know. You start thinking of the law of averages then, of course, and your, well, tension increases, I suppose.
Once we got to dispersal, we would get in the aircraft. Each individual member of the crew checked his own particular section. I mean, Les would have an engine test and check of all the engines. I would check all the electrical, whereas the gunners would check the guns. Len would go around checking the bombs, making sure they were all in their particular stations, making sure that they were fused and all perfectly all right.
If it was a long trip, the petrol bowser would come round and top up the tanks again. And then we get out of the aircraft onto the surrounding grass, which on reflection always seemed to be a nice warm evening to me. I suppose there must have been some wet ones, but I can't really remember those.
Everything went deathly quiet at the airfield. You know, you'd hear one shut down, and it got quieter and quieter and quieter as all the engines shut off. Then you've got outside and, you know, sat up against the wheels or something. And your old tummy used to churn right over, you know.
You could wait anything up to an hour before you actually took off. And you can imagine that at that time there was a lot of, in one's mind, a lot of apprehension, because you're always living with the sure knowledge that one of these days you may not come back. And I think when you're sitting out there on dispersal, waiting for the off, this was usually the thought that dragged across your mind most of the time. You tried to be casual, you tried to laugh it off, or even get a ball out and kick it about. One can imagine, say, 20 Lancasters nose to tail in a big queue waiting to take off down the runway, and at the takeoff point where they had the flight controller, you've got a green, very light shot in the sky, and number one would go off, and then the next one would go right the way through. And you usually got a collection of WAFs and ground crew standing at the end of the runway, and as each one went off, they'd give a little cheer.
I was personally more scared at that moment than any other time during any operational flight, because it's quite an achievement to get an aircraft off the deck. It's quite an achievement in itself. You have a machine that weighs 60 tons. It's carrying about 22,000 pounds of bombs and about 20,000 gallons of petrol. And you've got to get this thing off the ground. But as soon as the aircraft left the ground, reached safety height, I was all right, perfectly all right.
When you saw that Lincoln Cathedral was, you just hoped you'd see it again on the way back.
Finished, we were all posted our separate ways. I don't think any one of us ever got in touch again with any of the others.
Les Creed, pilot. Don Groskop, navigator. Len Hogburn, bomb aimer. Ross Elder, mid-upper gunner. Stan Atwood, flight engineer. Irwin Evans, rear gunner. Claude Horn, wireless operator.
We started off in our own particular trades, in separate batteries as wireless operators, you know, pilots, bomb aimers, navigators, gunners. And then we just all conglomerated together, the whole lot of us. And it was a case of, well, now look, it's entirely up to you. You've got to sort yourself out as far as crews are concerned. We were virtually just thrown together. It was like putting a load of peas into a pot and dipping your hand in and taking out 5, and that was it. You know, as long as you, different coloured peas, but as long as you took out one of each colour, and that was it. But I can't really remember how I came to pick Les Creed or anyone ever came to pick me, or vice versa.
Claude Horn lives in Brighton and has his own one-man business, mending washing machines.
Claude. Whenever we think of Claude, we always have a chuckle. Because he was a real scatterbrain, you know. But one thing I will say about him, that there wasn't a better wireless operator than him. He was really mustard on radio. He saved our bacon on a few times with getting fixes and all that under difficult conditions. But God, he had fingers like a fairy, you know. He really tuned that in.
The bomb aimer, Len Hogburn, is now managing director of a factory with a £250,000 turnover. He lives in Woking.
Len was always a cheerful, happy, and lively sort of person. He was never miserable or unhappy.
Londoner, wasn't he, Len Hogburn? He was a good bod. You could say anything to him.
no panic about him. In fact, I used to have to kick him to wake him up on the way back.
He was a great lad for singing. He used to sing Mr. Saturday Does. He'd get on my nerves, for heaven's sake, belt out. But he'd still keep on singing.
The rear gunner, Taffy. Now Sergeant I.C. Evans of the Welsh Constabulary, based in Aberystwyth.
Taff, of course, in the rear there. Getting cold all the time. Moaning about it.
I think Taff was very naive in that he'd no real experience at all of, you know, girls, beer, and the basic requirements of the 18-year-old.
Anything else, Sophie? Oh, nothing at all, sir. Nothing of importance.
Navigator, Don Groscop, lives in Essex and works in the purchasing division of Fords.
He used to be quite happy sitting back there on his own, you know, navigating away, all in the dark. And I could never understand this, because that would terrify me to be stuck back there not knowing what's going on, you know. And we were coming up to Stuttgart, and they put up a box barrier just as we got there. And I said to the navigator, well, you can pack up navigating now. Navigator, come up the front and have a look if you like. And I always remember, he says, yeah, righto, Skip. And he came up there, and even in the searchlights, I'm sure I could see his face go paler. He said, Christ, he said, you can have that. And I heard the old curtain go swish. There you go.
Well, we started off as a collection of individuals, obviously, but the one man that made us into a team would be Les, the captain of the crew.
I always admired him as a pilot. He did everything absolutely right. And I felt perfectly happy flying with him. And I don't think you'd ever get a better pilot, ever. And in my view, he should have stayed in flying. Definitely should have stayed in flying. He was a first-class pilot.
My greatest fear was that the war was going to be over before I could get in. I mean, what would I have done under normal conditions if it hadn't been the war? I'd have been wasting my time trying to do what I did there. I wouldn't have stood an earthly, because the first questions they used to ask you is, what was your father? What school did you go to? You know, you were clobbered right from the start. But in the war, you did have a chance.
Les Creed left the RAF for the upholstery trade and ran a garage, was chief flying instructor at Lasham, and is now assistant manager of a sweet factory near Aldershot.
I think all the crew will bear me out here that I was a strict disciplinarian. All our drills, you know, dinghy drills, bailing out drills, crash drills. There wasn't anybody on the squadron that could touch us. We went in for all sports. We had a rugby competition going, which, well, we won. We slaughtered the rest of the crews.
Well, I'm quite amazed at this terrific sense of purpose that he had, and he couldn't have been more than about 21 or 2. And he was very much the hard boy. I mean, in the air was just the same. When I wanted straight and level over the target area with the bomb doors open, I mean, he flew straight and level. Doesn't matter what was coming up or what was about, he just held tight. I mean, you know, he drove himself to a point of striving for a perfection, and he insisted everybody else did exactly the same. I felt at times he was a bit of a lunatic, that the way he tried to force things through all the time. Just wouldn't let up.
And as regards to parachute drill, Well, I reckon we broke all records, all the squadron records of getting out of an aircraft. And so many times, I forget what the time is now, but God, you know, that obviously paid off because on our first op, I had to bail them out.
Operation on Boulogne. We're in the Wellington aircraft. We were at about 13,000 feet, 14,000 feet, and over the target, and we must have got hit. We were under a certain amount of flak.
I mean, we got one engine alight, and then we finally put it out, and then the other one started to cough. Then we were going to ditch, and then we finally, let's sort of coax the thing across the channel, but we had to bail out.
Well, my left foot got caught in the main control of the rear turrets.
I'll never forget the looking down in just a black rectangular opening and having to jump out into nothing.
And I managed to sort of pull myself back in and release my leg and then jump out again. In fact, I don't think I should have jumped because I was below the safety height of opening for that particular type of parachute.
My first reaction was just hitting more. It felt like a solid wall of air. The next thing I knew, I pulled the ripcord, and both my flying boots were just sailing away up in the air.
It wasn't until I bailed them out that I remembered that I hadn't got any hydraulics, which meant I had to pump the undercar down by hand. Of course, this was a bit of a job. I forget how many pumps it was. I think it was over 300 or something to get the undercarriage down. I landed. No, I managed to stop before the end of the runway. But God, I always remember I had the old tight flying suit on then, the old leather jacket, leather trousers, suede boots. God, I was done up like a real airman, you know. And once I'd stopped, it was all over. I sweat. I was absolutely steaming, you know. The sweat was coming off me, just like a racehorse that run a 5-mile race, you know.
And I think probably, as I say, this was a blessing in disguise when I look back. It probably was a sudden realisation that all that we've been told wasn't a line shoot. It could happen, you see, and I think this probably made us turn a little towards him in that he could now say, well, look, now you see how important it is, I told you so. I mean, not that we could have done very much about that at that time, as inexperienced as we were, but I'm inclined to think it helped. You know, we knew a little what we could expect.
Of course, when we went on to Lancaster, the crew goes from 5 to 7, so you require then an engineer and a mid-upper. Well, the little engineer, I can always remember the way this little chap came in, seemed so young, straight from engineer's school. He just looked at me, little rosy cheeks, and said, "Hello, Skip." You know. Well, I think we all took to him straight away. So he really wanted mothering, you know.
Stan Atwood, the only member of the crew still in the RAF.
The mid-upper was a different kettle of fish.
Never remember him without a fag in his mouth, actually. No hands, just a cigarette hanging out, you know. Probably smoked himself to death by now.
Ross Elder now works in the stalls of a cement factory near Tring.
Well, Cree's lot, they seem to be the sort of a crowd who could sort of mix in together, but there were some of the other crews, the skipper and the navigator weren't interested in the lower ranks, such as the gunners. There was quite a bit of that. But no, I mean, we were all together and that was it.
I think you have to have efficiency and the ability to get along together. When you climbed into the aircraft, everybody knew that so long as everybody did their job properly, that there was every chance that the trip would be successful and we'd get back safely.
When you've done a couple of operational trips, I think this becomes more and more obvious. And then you find that you get terribly close to these people, far, far closer than you ever thought was possible, I think. We as a crew, I mean, all the other standards had gone. I mean, all we were concerned about was doing the job and surviving. And if we were going out for an evening, it wasn't a question of, well, I've got half a crown and he's got 10 shillings and the other fellow's got the pound. It was, what have we got? And it went on the table and that was divided up into how many pints it would buy and away we went. I mean, there was never any question about individuals. The same thing went on, you know, one hadn't a clean shirt and the other got one on and another in his bag, so he slung it over. One fellow was cleaning his shoes and the fellow that had the blacking got the shoes thrown at him and he cleaned a lot. You know, this was the way it was accepted and taken. And I suppose this is something that just comes out of this sort of situation, that you become so close that it's like animals, you're frightened and you sort of get together, I suppose. Herd.
You see, at that time, you must remember, I mean, the attitude was here today, gone tomorrow. You just didn't think about tomorrow. If there was a stand down from operations, the whole crew out on the beer, you know, and we really used to go on the beer. We used to go around Lincoln, and as you know, in those days, beer was rationed anyway. And we knew exactly, we could go to every pub, and as soon as one pub run dry, we used to say, well, we can go round to Wellington, theirs came in this afternoon, you know, we knew exactly where the beer was coming in.
Probably get to bed about 8 o'clock in the morning. At 10 o'clock, we lasted 10 away to go. All aircrew report to the briefing room. And if it didn't go, somebody would nip out smartly. So well, there's nothing on tonight, and that was it. You just see one shower of blokes disappearing in the direction of Lincoln. One of them take me, I'm not sure what double diamond there. But mind you, if there was anything on, well, we didn't go out. I mean, skipper wouldn't wear it. I believe one or two of the crews used to go out and get pretty well tanked up before the crew wouldn't have that. But I know some of them did, and I think they were the ones that didn't, quite often didn't get back.
I really don't know how to explain it, but even now, after all these years, I still get a hell of a thrill out of flying, looking down, small fields. Everything seems so unreal. Every place started spinning, looping. Oh, the world was sort of going all around me, you know. It didn't seem as if the airplane was moving, it was the ground just going up and round and twisting about, you know. Anyway, needless to say, I was as sick as a dog. And I came down, and God, they nearly had to lift me out of the cockpit. Anyway, the next morning came, and all I felt was right as rain. Another clear blue sky it was, crisp and cold. I thought, oh, wow, have another go, you know. I went up, sick as a dog again.
There was a time I used to take my coffee flask back with me to the rear turret. But when you came to drink it, all I had was one solid lump of ice and a broken thermos flask. I mean, I can remember one night we did fly in a temperature which was, I think, 59 degrees below zero.
It's wonderful to be up there and virtually away from it all. Get up in an aircraft, up above the clouds. It's always a perfect day. The sun's always shining.
It gives you rather a funny feeling when you're actually on a bombing run and you hear the wireless operator come up. He's got a little instrument there which can pick up these aircraft, and we heard him on the first instance. Fighter, port beam up, 2,000 yards. Well, straight away you can feel the atmosphere. Everybody tenses up, waiting for this.
There were times when you would see an enemy fighter, a German fighter, within easy shooting range, but it was absolutely useless. You didn't have any guns to fire at him. They were frozen solid.
We were flying in the dark, and apart from the occasional slipstream, which buffeted you about, you were operating as a separate entity. But when you got to the target, of course, you realised that there were aircraft all round you, both below and above and on either side.
We used to fly somewhere around about 20,000 feet. You look down below, you see the Halifaxes saying 18,000, and the poor old Sterlings, they seem to be almost on the deck, but they're about 12, 15,000. You see them all silhouetted and flying along.
You'd get a shell exploding, possibly just outside a wing, and a big mushroom of smoke. And yet there was, although one knew that it was terrifying in the thought that if it hit you, that was it, there was something beautiful about it at the same time.
Shooting at you.
You felt at that moment particularly vulnerable because it was terribly light.
You could see quite a lot of things, such as the bombs coming down from the aircraft above you.
It just looked as if the whole world was a ball of fire. There were clouds and clouds of pinkish red flames everywhere you looked. As far as the eye could see, I should think, for miles and miles and miles. It looked, as I say, as if the world had suddenly caught fire.
Looks something like hell, actually.
There was always an interminable delay between the bombs being released and the count, which we always had, for the photograph to be taken whilst the aircraft was held straight and level. This seemed to take a long time, and then it was bomb doors closed and nose down and full throttle and out of the way, you know.
I looked back, too. After we'd left the target area and we'd set course for home. And you could see these fires, I think, for 10 or 12 miles. It was a frightening thing to look at.
I think the raid on Munich is the raid that always springs to mind as one I did actually see and had a full and good view of. The city burning, and well, it seemed to be absolutely obliterated, you know, and the square absolutely alight. And you would have thought to be there that there wouldn't be any of Munich the following day, nor anybody alive, but this raid sticks in my mind out of all of them. I myself pretty well felt the terror of it, even though I was upstairs doing the bombing. I was almost there, on the ground in the burning city.
Like a moral fibre. Swines.
Coming back was the best of all landing, and I know I used to bend down and kiss the ground and say, "Oh, I'm glad to see you again."
This, I think, was the moment that gave you the most satisfaction. The fact that you had been there, you had attacked successfully, and you had come back, and now you were going off to debriefing to your hot mug of sweet tea and your eggs and bacon, and you felt that, oh, this is something else that has been done successfully. And you had that feeling every time. It was a great moment.
I think the worst part about the whole thing was you get back yourself, you know, you go to the briefing room for interrogation and so on, and you'd have a look around and see where everybody else had got to. You know, you hang on for about an hour, and then you just, well, that's it. You know, they were gone then. You probably arranged to booze up somewhere in Lincoln for that night, and they were. Doesn't look as though they're coming. Come on, now, it's bedtime. Come on. Get up on your perch and get to bed.
For me, anyway, the worst part of once you've got your head down, there were occasions when about 2 hours later, somewhere around about 9 o'clock in the morning, you'd hear some noises going on next door in the next billet, and clearing out and moving of furniture or moving of beds. And it usually meant then that the crew that had occupied that particular billet, that they hadn't got back.
I think it hits you hard when it was somebody who was close to you. There was one chap there, Bill Amphlett, who was with us from the first day we joined the squadron and kept level with us on operational trips, accomplished until we'd reached 10 piece, I think. And he had a terrible accident. He had landed safely from a trip, got out of his aircraft, got into a transport van to be taken back to debriefing room. And the transport van ran into the prop of an incoming aircraft.
I remember particularly one operation, Mailly Le Camp. I know Air Squadron sent out 10 aircraft, and only five got back. And one could sense the feeling the following day. It didn't only hit the air crews, it hit all, the whole squadron. I mean, even the chap who dished you up your grub in the mess, it was there. I mean,
we were all very young and, energetic. But I think we had the tendency to live, sort of day by day. Before any trip, any bomber mission, I would give my gold watch to the fitter. I would give him what English notes I would have. You know, I'd hand in my wallet. Always the same thing. I mean, if I don't come back, they're yours.
There was no contrition, you know, nobody sort of sat around weeping or feeling terribly sad. I mean, it just wasn't on. Blokes went out, young blokes like yourself, and I suppose deep down, obviously, we all knew that this could happen, and the answer was, well, if we didn't come back, have a drink on me.
You didn't actually forget your friends, but the faces on the squadron campus were changing all the time. You know, perhaps they were fed up with our faces by the time we finished, but...
You were extremely glad, thankful, and for my part, wondering why it should have been you. I suppose we shouldn't go into those realms, but out of all the others, I think a high percentage of it is on your crew, and particularly your pilot, of course. Why you have finished practically unscathed, as far as I know. But there are other factors which Bomber Command, the pilot, the crew, and nobody else can account for. And these are the things you think about when you walk on your own looking at the stars. Sometimes at night, even now.
I don't suppose people quite realise that the very heavy raid that was made on Coventry, for instance, I think the German Air Force used about 90 or so medium bombers, and their bomb load would be about 2,500 pounds. So 90 times 2,500 pounds was the weight of that raid. Whereas a maximum effort RAF bombing raid would be at least 400 four-engine aircraft, each carrying about 20,000 pounds of bombs. So it was, you know, so much heavier. And each and every raid was like that, and Coventry was just one outstanding raid.
I don't think anybody really had any idea what they were fighting for until it was all over. No, nobody, during the war years, nobody hated the Germans. You used to go out on the bombing raid and say, oh, poor devils. You know, bad luck on them, but you didn't hate them. I think the real hatred for the Germans came when we heard about the concentration camps and things like that. At the time, nobody go bomb them and say, oh, well, the feeling was, well, poor devils, it's either you or me, so that's it.
You know, looking back now, with 25 years on, one gets feelings of what happened, you know, the morality of the situation, all the other factors. But at that time, this to me was an adventure. It was something to do. It was a very effective way of hitting back.
I have come to wonder at times that were our efforts really helping the war or killing innocent people? I haven't dwelt on it, but I have had these thoughts from other people's thoughts on saturation bombing in general. It hasn't come to me, but I have thought about it.
We were being fed when I look back now anyway, I realise we were being fed with propaganda. And of course, I went quite happily that what I was doing was the right thing. I still think that what I did was the right thing.
Was some car hoisting the other day?
Yes, there are some coming up.
How many of those have you got?
2. They're in pretty good condition too.
We weren't terribly happy about actually dropping bombs on people. I don't think that was very funny. But nevertheless, it was a job that had to be done. And we were all convinced that we were helping Britain to win the war. And I was certain in those days, and I'm even more certain since, that had Britain not won the war, then life in this country just wouldn't have been worth living.
Right, this maniac at large in Europe that was going to invade these islands, this was very much on the cards, and we all believed this. Their very survival was threatened. I think that whilst you wouldn't give voice to this at the time, you knew this was accepted by you, and I think it very much conditioned your behaviour in that everything was reduced, as far as I could see it, to one simple sort of denominator in that you lived or you died. Now, you were concerned with survival. Therefore, since this was the only thing with which you were concerned, all the other distractions, all the other vices that from time to time are very much in the foreground, the pursuit of money, I mean, we weren't worried about, we were never faced with the question of meeting a mortgage, or whether we had to earn more money, or whether we lived in the right sort of house.
Well, for a few years after the war, everybody had the same spirit as we had during the war. You know, we're all in it together, that sort of thing. But nowadays, it's everybody for himself. I mean, nobody bothers about anybody else at all. People tell you it's the results of the war now. 25 years after, we're feeling the effects of it, but somehow I don't know. Well, I think everybody thought it was going to be such a wonderful land to live in after the war, and they found out that it isn't. And now it's everybody for himself. You know, blow you, Jack, I'm all right, sort of thing.
Well, it was a bit disconcerting, you know, to finish with the Air Force. Well, the change was, you know, a bit hard because your tempo of living was, you know, completely different. You had to reclimatize yourself to, you know, a different way of life, really, because, you know, squadron life was, you know, to say the least, a bit hectic.
Oh, well, God, I mean, anybody that was alive or doing anything in the war would tell you that things were entirely different then. I mean, you were working for one aim, weren't you? I mean, you could go anywhere and anybody would do anything for you. There was none of this real surliness or anybody ready to put a knife in your back as soon as you turn. There was none of this. You could go in any public house. There was always a sing-song going on. Any total stranger would come up and buy you a pint of beer or something like this. Everybody wanted to talk to one another, be friendly. I think it was wonderful, wonderful spirit. Homes fit for heroes and all this old codswallop, you know, which never came off. It was just one of those wartime things, I think, or just at the end of the war to, you know, political codswallop.
But then, you see, when you come out of a period like that into the immediate post-war years. Everybody wants to relax, don't they? Everybody wants to, if you like, enjoy the fruits of victory. There are no fruits of victory.
I kneel in my solitude and silently pray that heaven will protect you, dear, and there'll come a day the storm will be over and that we'll meet again at the shrine of Saint Cecilia. Cecilia.